Facebook and its billionaire founder, Mark Zuckerberg, have faced unwanted publicity and increased congressional scrutiny in recent months. Our next guest says beyond the particulars of Facebook's recent controversy, there's a larger theme involving entrepreneurs and their businesses. Dr. Andrew Taylor is professor of political science at North Carolina State University. Welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me, Mitch.
Before we get into that larger theme, first of all, you're not saying that Facebook deserves to skate or should not get any criticism.
No, like any other corporation or individual, they are under the law. And actions that are deemed illegal, obviously I do not condone. I don't think anybody should condone. I also don't condone sort of economic incompetence or financial incompetence. Although presumably, and as we saw immediately after what happened to Facebook, when some of the news came out about how sort of fast and loose, although not illegal, they were with users' privacy, there was market punishment in terms of the stock price, and I think obviously that is perfectly a good way for people to respond to those kinds of behaviors. So no, I'm not condoning those. But as you teased, my sort of point was more about how the Facebook episode tells us a lot about the way American popular opinion these days thinks about the role of corporations and entrepreneurs in public life.
And you wrote a column about this in Carolina Journal and talked about the fact that what really struck you was not that Facebook was getting criticism, but the type of criticism that it was getting. What just struck you as particularly interesting?
Yeah, the tone of the criticism in terms of both intensity and depth, but also the sort of broader nature of it. So there seems to be today a sort of general expectation, and this is, the Facebook episode is illustrative of it, but not the only example, that corporations have primarily, not just sort of secondarily, but primarily a social need, that they a social role to play, that their basic responsibility is to the broader general interest, whatever that is, and not to themselves, their employees, and their shareholders. And so when a company with the visibility of someone like something like a Facebook does these kinds of things, we're outraged. Because it does seem as though they've been doing things in their own economic self-interest. And so there really is that expectation. It's moved from being a sort of secondary thing that emerged, that sort of as part of what they do, corporations should have this sort of broader understanding of social collective interest, to it being the number one, the primary responsibility.
That is the voice of Dr. Andrew Taylor, professor of political science at North Carolina State University. You and I, growing up and in our early adult lives, heard people criticize corporations because they were out to get a buck, and that was all that they were thinking about. And then if there was some concern about the things that they did to the environment or in relation to some sort of social cause, it was, well, these bad out to get a buck businesses are also doing these other bad things. But this really sort of shifts the debate, doesn't it? It suggests that, well, all these other things, the things that keep the business in business, are secondary, and playing this social role is what we really should be focusing on.
Right, exactly. And of course, Facebook isn't a polluter, at least directly, but it's in a new game. I mean, we're in a new world here in the last 20 years, in the internet age, of course. And so now its primary responsibility is in terms of serving us. Which it needs to do by providing us services, which it does for free. I mean, this is one of the things that's sort of overlooked in the whole criticism of Facebook. Everybody who gets on Facebook doesn't pay anything. I mean, there are some charges. There are secondary apps that you might download and that you can get charged for. But Facebook itself is free. And it's providing this tremendous service, It's sort of stoked up our expectations of what we want of it. And so it's not because, as you said, it pollutes. It's not really necessarily because it makes a lot of money. It gives us stuff, and then when it does bad things, we're upset because how dare you? It's almost bringing our own name and dragging it through the mud. So yeah, no, this expectation is elevated from a sort of secondary tier to our principal, our belief that it's the principal cause or the principal role of corporations like Facebook.
Now, you are not a professor of business management or economics. You are a professor of political science. What are the political implications of this change in the way people are looking at businesses?
Well, obviously, there is an expectation amongst the public that governments create policies that restrain their behavior more and extract from them directly sort of public service. Now, a lot of economists and people like myself who sort of dibble and dabble a little bit in economics sort of subscribe to the view that Adam Smith had, that by sort of pursuing their own self-interest, corporations actually generate social value. But this isn't the expectation now. And so from political science perspective, I'm concerned that governments are going to respond to these views of the mass public and, of course, interfere in the operations of individual corporations and in the marketplace generally, which would be to the detriment not just of those corporations, but of the actual collective good, in fact. And so there are policy implications, and you see it particularly with regards to Facebook. You're seeing it especially on the other side of the pond in the Europeans. Of course, it's an American company, and there may be some sort of nationalistic impulse there by the Europeans, but they have become very aggressive towards American technology companies, particularly the big internet giants, including Facebook, in terms of trying to regulate them and control what they do with data.
You mentioned government's increased involvement in business. Is there also the possibility of the other way around? Businesses that might have said in the past, we don't really need to worry too much about government, see a need to get more involved in government to protect themselves.
Of course, and in fact, you've seen that greatly in Silicon Valley, more generally. So it was interesting in the 1990s when the internet age really took off. There was a lot of media coverage, a lot of academic coverage of the fact that it was surprising that big internet and computer companies, back then we're talking more like Microsoft, didn't have large Washington operations. They didn't spend a lot of money on lobbyists. They didn't spend a lot of money on political action committees and campaigns. And much of that was because they didn't think it was necessary. The government was doing its thing and they were doing their thing. But now, of course, with these increased regulations, the response is to lawyer up and lobby up. And so we've got a significant presence from companies like Facebook and old tech giants like Microsoft in Washington.